For Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Today, we recognize the Sisters in Spirit Vigil on the front steps of the House of Commons and all across the country. Many families and survivors of violence against murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. Glad that the inquiry has started, but also expressing still a great deal of trauma, sadness. We still have such a long way to go to achieve closure for these families. And I really want to recognize in this House the advocacy and the strength of the families and the Indigenous organizations that have got us to this point. And that have pushed to make the inquiry a reality. Now, the inquiry was actually announced during the summer while this House was not in session. Indigenous organizations, representatives of families articulated 5 concerns about the terms of reference for the inquiry, and I'd like to get on the record what the government's response to those dissatisfactions was. It may be that they tweaked the terms of reference or did incorporate those concerns. So the first one is that the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women inquiry should have full access to trauma-informed and culturally appropriate counselling, and that would not be limited to the duration of their appearance before the Commission. That's culturally appropriate supports before, during, following any testimony. The second area of concern was whether the inquiry would compel the reopening of cold cases and cases that were dismissed maybe accidentally as accidents or suicides. The third area, what is the role of the police, the provinces and territories in the inquiry? We need full participation of those provincial agencies to know that we're getting at the child welfare problems, the domestic violence shelter, all of the police forces that are controlled either by provinces, territories, Indigenous governments, or the federal government. The fourth area of concern is that there was no explicit mention of the need to work with justice partners. Does our criminal justice system deal adequately? And what can we do to address the systemic discrimination that Indigenous people have faced in the justice system? And then finally, the need for an addition of a 6th commissioner who is an Inuit woman. The president of Pauktutit, Rebecca Kudlu, said, I quote, "For this inquiry to be meaningful to Inuit, it must be led by an Indigenous woman, including us Inuit women. This is, to me, a fundamental matter of principle, equality, and trust." So I'd like to hear from the government. How did it fill those gaps? How is it moving forward? And I hope that some of these identified problems have been filled. We would all benefit from knowing that Indigenous families and advocacy organizations were heard and that their concerns are now reflected in the final terms of reference for the inquiry now underway. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise to respond to the question from the Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith here on traditional Algonquin territory. It is particularly poignant that we are discussing this matter of national importance tonight. Every year, October 4th has become dedicated to honouring the lives of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and supporting families who have been tragically touched by loss of a loved one to violence. Earlier today here on Parliament Hill and across the country, vigils and other ceremonies were held to honour the memory of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We join their families and loved ones in our shared commitment to end the violence. As members are aware, the government launched a national inquiry to seek recommendations on concrete actions which governments and others can take to address and prevent violence against Indigenous women and girls. All Indigenous voices are paramount to this government and to this process. The government would like to thank Pauktuti and the Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, or ITK, for their input into the pre-inquiry process, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, the ITK and Inuit leadership have been very involved in the engagement of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Inuit leaders speak about violence in the home, the need for shelters, safe housing, and needed reform of the justice system, Mr. Speaker. Over the winter and spring, the Honourable Ministers of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, Justice, and Status of Women heard firsthand the needs and expectations of survivors, family members, and loved ones for the design of this inquiry. They heard from more than 2,100 participants at 18 face-to-face meetings with one or more ministers present across the country, including in Inuit regions, Mr. Speaker. The engagement also involved obtaining the views on the design of the inquiry from national and Indigenous organizations. On August 3rd, the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, Minister of Justice, and Attorney General of Canada, and the Minister of the Status of Women announced 5 commissioners who will lead the truly national inquiry, as well as the terms of reference for the national inquiry. The commissioners named to the inquiry have the background, characteristics, and experience we heard was necessary in the pre-design phase to lead this inquiry. The inquiry will both recommend concrete actions to prevent future violence, Mr. Speaker, as well as help identify the underlying causes of this ongoing national strategy. The government is also taking immediate action on root causes with historic investments on priorities including women's shelters, safe water, housing, education, and child welfare. In the North, Mr. Speaker, this government is investing in a wide variety of areas, including infrastructure, affordable housing, education, physical and mental health, helping Inuit and Northerners to secure the foundations of healthy and safe communities. Mr. Speaker, Canada is grateful to the survivors, families, loved ones, and Indigenous representative organizations who provided input during the pre-inquiry process. The input received helped shape the inquiry that commissioners will now be leading. Mr. Speaker, we will rebuild trust, ensure justice for both victims and survivors, and healing for their families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With respect to my colleague across the floor, he hasn't answered any of the questions that I asked tonight. And again, I thought I was giving the government an opportunity to show us, to tell us how they had incorporated the feedback of these most valued partners. For this government to say that relationship with Indigenous people is the most important relationship they have, but then not be able to say these are the ways that we've incorporated their input is very saddening. The words we heard on the front steps of the House of Commons today, we heard people say that in Cree, sorry means action. We heard survivors ask inside the House of Commons, how would you feel it was your daughter that disappeared? Would you say that you had done enough? They asked, where's the support for families, for trauma, for victims, for addictions? They said they don't want to wait till the end of the inquiry to see real change. And very much they want to know that their outstanding concerns about the inquiry have been addressed. So I'll give the government a final time to brag about the good work they've done and to express my great hope that we can work together and achieve the result we need in this country for Indigenous women and girls.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll repeat for the honourable member that there has been unprecedented engagement in the design of the inquiry, the input of Paktuti and ITK into the pre-inquiry engagement was instrumental in ensuring that the terms of reference reflects the views from Indigenous voices from coast to coast to coast in every corner of the country, including from Inuit peoples. And as I have said, Mr. Speaker, the commissioners named to lead the inquiry have the background, characteristics, and experience we heard was necessary in the pre-inquiry design phase to lead this inquiry. With the commissioners now beginning that work, the inquiry will recommend concrete actions to prevent future violence and identify the underlying causes of this ongoing national strategy, Mr. Speaker. This government is also determined to work with all those who have been impacted, including Inuit leadership and communities, to take immediate action combating the violence, and I think that answers the honourable member's question. Mr. Speaker, in addition to Budget 2016 investments for on-reserve women's shelters, This government also announced an investment of $89.9 million over 2 years for the construction and renovation of shelters and transition houses for victims of violence in provinces and territories, and many other measures. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.